During the early stages of the Korean War, a large number of South Korean communists, communist sympathisers, or those mistakenly seen as communists were massacred by their government. Seen as potential spies or fighters for the advancing North Korean army, thousands were massacred to avoid such people swelling up the ranks of the communists. In many instances, those committing the murders did so with the approval or go-ahead of their American army allies. In today's video, we will briefly discuss the start of the Korean War, the early massacres, and the subsequent cover-up. It is perhaps helpful to start with the Japanese colonization of Korea in 1910. During this time, Japan set about destroying Korean history and culture, set about instilling Koreans as manual laborers, and pushed for the worship of the Japanese emperor. In short, Koreans were often treated as second-class citizens by the Imperial Japanese. By the end of the Second World War, the Korean peninsula had been devastated, and Japan was forced to give up its colonial holdings over Korea. Both China and the Soviet Union had organized Korean forces against their Japanese colonial masters, and towards the end of the war, the United States landed in the South, in part to limit the Soviet influence. And by the end of the war, America had identified that next big threat. Korea was divided into two occupation zones, much like in occupied Germany. Whilst this was intended to be temporary, there would not be another unified Korea. The Soviets and Americans agreed to split Korea along the 38th parallel. This was an arbitrary decision, as it roughly divided the country in half. However, this was not an equal split, with much of the industrialized areas under American control along with most of the population. In the north, the Soviets helped set up a communist regime under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, whilst the United States established a military dictatorship in the south led by Syngman Rhee. With such diametrically opposed political factions in control and over half of the country with desires to control the whole, the path to war was all but set. Border clashes were commonplace in the late 1940s. Attempts by the United Nations were made to seek a referendum, which would allow Koreans to decide their own form of democratic governance. However, this was rejected by the North and Soviets, who refused to allow UN officials to administer the vote. These elections were a key trigger for the Daeju uprising, which saw around 30,000 people killed, with around half being civilians. The Soviet Union left North Korea in 1948, having achieved its aims. It had established a friendly communist government, overseen the nationalization of much of the North Korean industry, and land was seized and redistributed, with some 400,000 people fleeing from the north in the face of the new regime. The Soviets had supplied the North Korean forces whilst leveraging their influence and economic dominance to ensure Communist China's support of the Kim Il-sung's forces. The Soviet Union had created a dependent ally in the region, with support from Mao's Communist China. In the south, the Americans initially limited the political power of the Koreans, for fear of them aligning with the Communist North. Syngman Rhee was installed as the first president of South Korea, in large part due to his staunch anti-communist views. There was not just communist activity in the north, but also throughout the entire peninsula. Communists were active in the Workers' Party of South Korea until a law passed banning such North-aligned political parties. Even after its banning, the North and South parties unified, with attacks leading to the deaths of thousands of South Korean police officers. Instead, the Korean War broke out between the Soviet and Chinese-backed northern half of Korea and the United States and United Nations-backed South. When the Americans left Korea in 1949, they had not invested as heavily in the South Korean military, leaving behind only a few hundred American troops. By 1950, Kim Il-sung had grown increasingly confident that he would be able to unite Korea under his communist leadership. This was in large part due to the constant communist agitation and attacks taking place in the South. Kim Il-sung had pressed for permission to attack from Stalin in 1949. Though it was only when China was fully under Maoist control and when the Soviets had tested their first nuclear bomb that he gave the go-ahead. The Soviets would not provide any ground forces for the invasion. This would be provided by the Chinese if needed. Instead, experienced Soviet generals planned the attack as part of an advisory group. The North Korean forces numbered around 200,000 strong, with hundreds of tanks and artillery. The South Korean army lacked any tanks, having been denied such weapons from the Americans. Their army numbered less than 100,000 and they were poorly equipped and poorly trained. On the 25th of June 1950, the North crossed the 38th parallel and largely routed the South Korean forces. Stalin had calculated that the Americans would not intervene, seeing Korea as not a particularly important region. Nevertheless, there was a fear by the Americans that the war could escalate and lead to another world war. Notably, there was a fear that if Korea fell, that Japan would fall next. Before the onset of the war, the South was dealing with a number of communist insurgent attacks. In the spring of 1949, there was an increase in the attacks made from the mountainous regions. These were carried out by the People's Guerrilla Units, with backing from the North Korean commandos and South Korean soldiers who had defected. The goal was to destabilize the South Korean government and prepare the way for the impending invasion. At the same time, border clashes intensified. In October of 1949, they launched a number of successful counterinsurgency operations in South Chola and Daegu, killing or capturing over 5,000 North Korean guerrillas. By the spring of 1950, insurgency activity had been all but destroyed, with the border quieter. For those who were considered communists or sympathizers, there was an effort to re-educate the civilian population. This was done by the National Bodo League. Bodo, meaning caring and guiding, was a quota-driven program, resulting in many being enrolled who had nothing to do with communism. Some were enticed to join the League in exchange for more rations. The official goal was to reintegrate and educate leftists and make them acceptable members of society. Similar Japanese programs had been run, and for those South Koreans who had worked alongside the Japanese, this seemed to be the perfect solution to maintaining law and order and protecting their new government. Although Bodo League membership was officially voluntary, the South Korean government registered former communists as a way to keep tabs on those considered a threat. It soon began to include anyone who was considered anti-government, not just communists. It is perhaps best put by one of the survivors to the massacre, who stated, "The authorities pressed us to join the League. We had no idea that we were joining a death row." When North Korean forces invaded on the 25th of June 1950, beginning the Korean War, President Syngman Rhee ordered the execution of people related to either the Bodo League or the South Korean Workers' Party. Summary executions of civilians and political prisoners suspected of being potential allies to the North began on the 27th of June 1950. The goal was to stop the political prisoners joining the communists in the war effort. On the 29th of June 1950, as the Southern Army retreated from Seoul, it was reported that communists had emptied the prisons and political prisoners were joining the North's ranks. The 300,000 members of the Bodo League were the first and clearest targets for the first round of executions, all deemed potential enemy combatants. The police dragged political prisoners from their jails, massacred them, and buried the bodies in pre-dug pits. In the coastal towns, people were just thrown into the sea. Outside the city of Daejeon, hundreds of prisoners were executed in the fields outside of the city. At the Gyeongsang cobalt mine, prisoners were beaten, shot, and even set alight with flamethrowers before being tossed down the mine shaft. It is thought that some 3,500 people were killed at Gyeongsang. When Seoul was recaptured from the North Vietnamese forces in September of 1950, an estimated 30,000 South Koreans were regarded as collaborators with the communists, and because of this, were summarily executed. All of this was done without any trial or sentencing of the condemned. In some instances, American officers witnessed the massacres unfold, taking photographs to document the murders, some of the first being taken in Daejeon. American soldiers stood by, unable to intervene, only able to document what they were witnessing. The photographs of the executions were passed up the chain of command, only to be stamped secret and sequestered away as classified documents for years. It was largely seen as an internal matter and something that the international community should leave up to the Koreans. This, however, did not stop a number of Korean officers seeking approval from their American counterparts for the massacres to take place. One known example is of Lieutenant Colonel Rollins Emmerich. He at first denied South Korean Colonel Kim Jong-won's request to kill political prisoners held in Busan. However, his order changed, and stated that should the communist forces approach the city, the murders would be approved to prevent them joining the enemy forces. Sure enough, some 3,500 political prisoners were massacred in Busan later that year. Not all foreign observers in the region stood back and watched the massacres unfold. There was condemnation from a number of Christian ministers, and notably the Archbishop of York protested the treatment of political prisoners. An area outside of Seoul, dubbed Execution Hill due to a large number of people being killed there, was occupied by the British forces to deter any further massacres, with the Korean officer threatened with his own execution if he were to proceed. What was most shocking to the outside world was the large number of children and infants reportedly massacred alongside the adults. Reports often included mention of children in the truckloads of prisoners, or of infants clinging to their mothers' backs as they were forced into the graves. It was not until 1999 that evidence gathered by American soldiers was released. This was only achieved following the determined effort by psychologist Do Young Lee, whose father had been murdered by South Korean forces in August of 1950. Research carried out by the Associated Press has found no evidence that General Douglas MacArthur, the man in overall command, took any action to stop the massacres. Soon enough, South Korean forces stopped journalists from visiting the execution sites. The American State Department advised diplomats to stop commenting on the massacres. Those journalists who did report on the massacres were often denounced as liars. The American command would go on to put the blame for the massacres carried out in Daejeon on the North Koreans. This was possible as the communists had carried out their own massacres of right-wing Koreans, and so it was the perfect cover for the murder of South Korean communists as well. The sheer speed and reach of the massacres all pointed to a dedicated and well-coordinated operation, ordered and organized by President Ri and his security chiefs. There is, however, little in the way of evidence, and many of the leading officials are long dead. This, however, did not stop the Korean Truth and Reconciliation Commission from carrying out its investigation into what happened, in large part relying on witness testimony and American classified documents. The commission concluded that estimates of 100,000 killed were conservative, with estimates as high as 200,000 killed. The Bodo League massacres are truly disturbing for the speed in which they occurred, and just how many were massacred. Yet, there is little information available, in part due to limited information from Korea, and the amount of classified information by the Americans. Just how a country could tear itself into two is difficult to comprehend, seeing enemies within that need to be destroyed. But with the intervention of the Soviet Union and the American governments as part of the Cold War mentality, the cruelest elements of society rose to take command and plunge the country into a war that still rages to this day. A ceasefire was only agreed in 1953. The Bodo League massacres are a grim reminder of the possible consequences of such vitriolic political divides, and a reminder of what those in power are willing to do to cling to control.